Yes, I've got a notification, yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, we are live. All right, welcome everyone to the third edition, the third episode of 1+1, your place for truth-telling and myth-busting. Sorry about that. And we are joined today by a member of the Socialist Equality Party, Chris Marsden. We're going to be talking about the last general election that happened in Britain, the devastating loss that the Corbyn project faced, and the new stage of the of endless austerity and warmongering led by Boris Johnson's Tory party. Where does the left go from here? And we're going to also be talking a lot about, and we're also going to be talking about where the Trotskyist movement, how the SCP and the Trotskyist movement in Britain, how they can fill the void which has been left by the Corbyn project. So, Chris, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Youri. Well, nice to see you.
Likewise, and oh, I have to mention, Chris. Chris is also a contributor to the World Socialist website, and I really recommend people go to the World Socialist website, especially to read up on everything that's happening in Britain, but also elsewhere. It's a really valuable source and informative place to know what's happening in the world, and to also be weary of the real enemy within the left, don't you think, Chris?
I can't recommend it highly enough, Youri. It's the premier international socialist news source. It's the most widely read. It's not just a source for news for Britain. It's the publication of the International Committee of the Fourth International. We have regular daily news coverage of the United States, Canada, India, Europe, Britain, Australia, everywhere, the world over.
Yeah. I was reading some stories on New Zealand with the with the upcoming election that's going to be happening this year unless it's postponed, and I said to myself, wow. This is a tour de force in truth-telling and myth-busting. So, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's. Now, Chris, before we get to before we do the election autopsy of what happened last year, first I want to ask you a bit about the SCP and Trotskyism. So my first question is this: what is a Trotskyist, and why does it have both a good and a bad reputation in the UK? Because I think too many people who, when they hear Trotskyist, they get Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday. And he paints a very grim picture of this sort of left-wing cult. That's often how he depicts Trotskyism. But then others on the left in the UK and the US also are a bit skeptical of Trotskyism. So what is a Trotskyist, and why does it have both a good and a bad reputation?
That's a very good question, Youri. It's not one that I can give an easy snap answer to, but Trotskyism is the present day continuation of the perspective that was fought for by Marx, by Engels, by Lenin's Bolshevik Party, and by Trotsky, both as a leading figure within the Bolshevik Party and then as the foremost defender of the socialist perspective against Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, which is the perspective of world socialism. The Trotskyist movement emerged in the aftermath of the October Revolution in Russia. which was conceived of by Lenin and by Trotsky, who, led the fight for the overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of the world's first workers' state, as the opening shot of a world international revolutionary movement that would certainly occur in Europe and develop on a world scale. I mean, socialism was always based on an understanding that the basic fundamental contradictions within world capitalism were twofold. First, there was the contradiction between social production involving millions and the private ownership of the means of production by the capitalist class that produce for profit. And the second major contradiction within world capitalism was the fact that capitalism had developed a world economy, but that was divided up into hostile and antagonistic nation states, in which the most powerful states, the imperialist states, had divided the world up between them through colonial wars of conquest, and that conflict eventually erupted in the First World War, and the answer to the working class to that terrible conflagration was actually provided by Lenin and Trotsky in the seizure of power in Russia. But Russia was a very backward country. They never conceived of the fact that they could build socialism in Russia, socialism in one country. Their first task, given the fact that the parties of the Second International had betrayed and supported the imperialist war, was to build a new international, the Third International. And their perspective was to build the necessary socialist leadership to seize power in the more advanced countries, say Germany, for example, and in that way provide the material foundations for the development of socialism. But those revolutions, because the parties that were built at a very late stage after major betrayals in the Second International, they weren't successful in their revolutionary struggles. And the Soviet Union became isolated. And instead of being able to meet human need, they were attacked by innumerable capitalist armies. There was the White Guards. They went through a whole period of civil war. They were ruined. It's a backward peasant economy. And under those circumstances, there was a bureaucratization of the state and the Bolshevik Party itself. That is, a certain conservative section began to develop, which turned away from a revolutionary perspective, was more concerned with defending their narrow privileges, and developed a very national orientation as opposed to the international orientation on which the revolution had been made. And they put the perspective they said is that never mind about the world revolution, we're going to build socialism in a single country. Now, Trotsky opposed that development. He opposed it on every sphere in which the bureaucracy was turning away from a revolutionary perspective. He saw this as the product of imperialist pressure and class differences that continued within Russia that had given rise to this bureaucracy that represented the interests of imperialism within the workers' state. But a whole series of struggles emerged, and betrayals and false policies implemented by the Stalinists, whether it was in Britain, China, Germany, led to a series of terrible defeats for the working class, which ironically, in one sense, served to strengthen the bureaucracy. So Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union, and he initially formed a left opposition. After the Stalinists allowed Hitler to come to power in Germany without a shot being fired, said you need to build a new international party. And that party was a fourth international as opposed to the third international. Now, that is the origin of Trotskyism as an independent tendency. It was the continuation of a previous perspective, but it was one informed by this vital, world-shaking struggle against the emergence of Stalinism. So when Trotskyism is seen as negative, it's seen as negative for two reasons. It's seen as negative by the imperialist capitalist class because it's the most consistently revolutionary tendency, the sole really seriously revolutionary tendency on the face of the planet. And it's seen as a pariah tendency by the Stalinists and by the Social Democrats because Trotskyism is associated with the political struggle against their betrayals and for a genuinely revolutionary perspective. So as far as they're concerned, the ultimate insult is to call someone a trot.
Yeah. I've noticed that
everywhere you see. But I mean, and it's used quite liberally, even to against people who've got nothing whatsoever to do with being Trotskyist.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyone who kicks against the pricks, who doesn't conform, at some point, if there's a chance that they may be called a Trotskyist. The difference between them and us is we are Trotskyists. We're proud of being Trotskyists. We are called Trotsky not because of our support for an individual, but our defense of an historically determined program and a history of struggle in the working class for socialism against every other tendency that betrayed it. And that doesn't earn anyone any kudos or favors amongst the people that you're fighting against. But as far as the working class is concerned, the most significant figure of the 20th century and now the 21st is the person of Leon Trotsky. Not simply because of his individual personality, but because what he did and those that rallied to his banner was save the perspective of world socialism and of Marxism from destruction at the hands of Stalinism. If that had not been done, then there could have been a terrible, monumental, devastating break in the political arsenal of the international working class. And now we're entering into a major economic, social and political crisis. There wouldn't be the necessary program, perspective and leadership to take a struggle forward for socialism. So that's why if anyone understands these processes, then to be called a Trotskyist is the greatest badge of honor that anyone can ever be afforded.
Now, is it safe to say, before I go to this next question, is it safe to say that because communism, both as a term and as a so-called system of government, because it has so much baggage because of the unspeakable horrors that Stalin unleashed on the Russians and other places which got absorbed into the USSR, like Ukraine, Georgia, and places like that. That to be a Trotskyist, in which you do believe in Marxism, you do champion some of the you do champion the writings of Vladimir Lenin, who founded who led the Bolshevik Revolution. So is that why many on the so-called respectable mainstream left marginalize marginalized Trotskyists, even though Trotskyists do denounce the human rights abuses of a Chairman Mao or a Joseph Stalin?
Well, I wouldn't attribute such confused or semi-benign motives to the official left. The official left is opposed to Trotskyism because they're opposed to socialist revolution. These are pro-capitalist tendencies. Their argument is that you can reform the profit system so that there can be some social compact between the ruling class and the working class. And the Trotskyist movement is not associated with the crimes of Stalinism. There is no tendency outside of ours that has been so consistently opposed to all of the crimes perpetrated by Stalin. Even when others around the world were engaging in détente, including Social Democrats, when Jeremy Corbyn, for example, was writing his column for the Morning Star and taking as his leading advisors Stalinists such as Seamus Milne and Andrew Murray. He's not a Stalinist, but he found common ground with the Stalinists despite the crimes perpetrated against the international working class in a way that he would never extend a hand of friendship to us, because they are kindred spirits. They're opponents of the independent political mobilization of the working class for socialism. So I can understand the term you're saying about the respectable left. It's the capitalist left. It's not how respectable it is a measure of the fact that the ruling class doesn't see them as a threat. They see them as an ally. Of course, there are occasions when war can be waged against someone like Jeremy Corbyn. And he can be slandered and accused of all sorts of things that he is not. But it was never about Jeremy Corbyn as an individual. It was always about the fear within ruling circles that Corbyn risked arousing certain sentiments in the working class that ultimately he may not be able to control. I mean, after all, they got everything under control with the Blairites. The Labour Party was a sort of semi-officially Thatcherite party with a few bells and whistles stuck on it that was committed to such phrases as "we are intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich."
Yeah.
Right. And there was a reaction in the working class that brought Corbyn to power. But even when they were attacking him, they were attacking something else. Hence their constant reference to the fact that Corbyn had let in the Trots and various. There's just been a document that's come out which Corbyn's allies and advisors were compiling because they'd allowed the Blairites to attack them as anti-Semites without expelling them from 2015 onwards, and it got to the point where there was a legal case going to be brought before the Human Rights Commission, and they compiled a dossier
on the fake anti-Semitism crisis, yes. Right?
And they compiled a dossier of the activities of their opponents, which they knew about, but they never revealed until there was a danger that they could actually end up with some sort of criminal prosecution against them. And now this document has just been released after the event. But what's striking about this document, because we've done it, we're going to write on it, but there are 330 references to Trotskyists and Trots in this document.
Oh wow!
we're going to look at it, but everybody they wanted to get rid of was routinely denounced as Trots. Trotskyists. Corbyn's letting in the Trotskyists. He wasn't. But for them, the word Trotskyist is synonymous with the socialist threat. Now that means something. That means something, and every conscious working class person in the world should consider the implications of that, because the ruling class is in no doubt about where the threat comes from.
Interesting, very interesting. And what is the one last thing about that? Any thoughts on on Peter Hitchens and how he depicts the Trotsky movement, which apparently he used to be part of?
I think you're thinking of, well, he was very briefly, him and his brother, Christopher
Christopher
Hitchens.
Hitchens, who I'm no fan of.
Well, I'm certainly, I'm not a fan of neither of them. One's, no longer with us, but I think both of them, as I recall, were members of the Socialist Workers' Party or its predecessor, the International Socialists. Peter Hitchens is a very right-wing conservative.
Yeah.
He's a horrible individual whose views are equally despicable. But if Peter Hitchens doesn't like me, my party, and my tendency, I can live with that.
That's a pretty good response, actually. And I'll just say one thing about Peter Hitchens. I actually have a really good book of his about World War II called the World War II. The Phony Victory, the World War II Illusion, which I think is quite an interesting book where he goes after a lot of the myths around World War II. The thesis of the book, which unfortunately he didn't get too much into, was how World War II is cynically used for more imperial wars.
Well, Youri, if we're going to have a discussion, I don't really want to let it be dominated by the person of Peter Hitchens. Let's.
All right.
It's not that I don't have a view on him, but you can get sidetracked a little bit.
Okay, no problem. So this other question related to Trotskyism, because there was a period where I got very angry at, I think, a section of the Trotskyist movement, or those who claim to carry the banner of Trotskyism. And which was why I think I was a bit skeptical of reading anything that came from the World Socialist website. But then I realized something, which is you are the ICFI, and there's another group that claims to be Trotskyist called the ISO, right?
The International Socialist Organization.
I believe so. Yeah, that one.
They used to be. They've liquidated themselves. That was the American section of the state capitalist tendency in the United States. The tendency was founded initially by Tony Cliff in Britain. They are one of several tendencies that took as a position that the Russian Revolution was defeated, and what emerged then was a new capitalist class. And that it was called it a form of state capitalism. Trotsky Trotsky opposed that definition. He said it was it was not correct because in the person of the bureaucracy, they didn't have either the legitimacy or the function that a capitalist class played within capitalism, the bourgeoisie. You can't have capitalism without a bourgeoisie. It is the owner, it owns and controls the means of production. It's integral to the system. The bureaucracy emerged as a parasitic development within the Soviet Union. Hence, they could never legitimately pass on their privileges to their sons and daughters. And they didn't play a role within the system other than as an obstacle to its proper functioning. It was a parasitic bureaucratic caste rather than a class. Now that's not just a definition, but because the reason why where the state capitalists went is, he said their basic conclusion was the whole process of the revolution was premature, that it wasn't time for socialism, and they actually developed a theory whereby the entire world was developing towards a form of state capitalism.
Ah, okay.
It took one form in the Soviet Union. It took another form in the advanced Western imperialist countries, in which you had nationalization of certain elements of the economy. And they basically said it was a new stage in capitalism, which meant that the prospect of revolution was delayed considerably. That Lenin was wrong.
Yeah.
There was still life in the old dog. And they used that to justify their hostility to the development of the Revolutionary Party, and to say that really it was still the real leadership of the working class would continue to be for decades to come the Labour Party in Britain, or the Democratic Party in the United States, the trade unions. In some instances, they were explicitly anti-communist. For instance, in the Korean War, they refused to defend North Korea because they said that in as much as Russia was capitalist, the Soviet Union was capitalist, and America was capitalist, it was a fight between two imperialist countries.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore you couldn't oppose US imperialism. You had to oppose both of them.
Did they take that and did they take that same position when it came to the Vietnam War? Because I heard that that the ISO was also yeah. I mean they weren't for American imperialism in Vietnam and their allies, but they also refused to sort of defend the Vietnamese's right to defend itself in self-determination, right? Or
well, they always it takes the form of a sort of extreme form of liberalism rather than socialism. They do oppose imperialist wars, and sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Because they were big supporters of of the Syrian war and arming moderate, non-existent rebels, and many of them led a very vicious smear campaign against journalists and media critics like Rania Khalek, Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, and so forth, who were saying to people that, guys, the Syrian war and the Assad must go line. This is the Libya, Iraq war, Afghanistan war all over again.
Well, what's actually happened is what did the emergence of these tendencies represent? Most of them emerged as opposition tendencies from within the Fourth International. I mean, there was two sort of state capitalist tendencies. One was led by Max Shachtman, the other was led by Tony Cliff. Others, other sort of expressions, but they're the two major ones that are still alive and kicking today, in one form or another. And what did it represent? It drew its sort of social base in a sort of middle class layer of academics who abandoned Trotskyism initially at the outset of the Second World War, and the drawing up of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and they said you could no longer defend the Soviet Union because of this betrayal, and they began to develop all sorts of rationales for it. But it ended up as a sort of anti-communism dressed in a certain left language,
yeah,
that supported the imperialist powers. So it was a lurch to the right of a middle class social layer. But that was taking place far more broadly. That was a manifestation of a broader social process that, in the aftermath of the war, really took off, because the only way that they could stabilize capitalism after the Second World War was to develop some sort of social base of support for capitalism. So the welfare state, which was giving us concessions to the working class, for example, benefited a large layer of the middle class a lot. I mean, they were the ones that got the free university. They built positions, they developed positions within local government, within academia, within the trade union bureaucracy. And what the state capitalists did is that they were part of that process, but translated it into a sort of pseudo-Marxism to attack socialism. So they developed all sorts of theories like, their responsibility was to encourage, put rank and file pressure on the trade unions to keep the trade unions pushing to the left. They would support the Labour Party to push it to the left. They would support the Democratic Party to push it to the left. So they said to anyone who was inclined towards socialism and revolution, say, yes, we're a revolutionary party, but we're realists. And what we're going to say to you is go back into the parties that you don't really believe in and push them to the left. Pressure on the streets, pressure in the workplaces to push the left leaders to the left. So they're always the cheerleaders for the Jeremy Corbyns, the Bernie Sanders, etc., etc. They don't have an independence from the bureaucracy. They're sort of left bagmen. And what they do, however, is that they reserve a special vitriol for anyone who doesn't go along with that nonsense, that fights to mobilize the working class against the bureaucracy. They are the sectarians, the ultra lefts. That's how they describe us. But they're moving ever further to the right because that layer is becoming increasingly privileged in comparison with most working people. I mean, if they had a house, that house has gone up massively in value because of the property boom. They had private pensions. They benefited from the expansion of share capital. They inherited from their parents, and they became increasingly sort of comfortable and increasingly right wing. So their position on Syria and Libya, etc., is not an accident. It's because they calibrate everything that they say to legitimize in the final analysis the existing social order. You can criticize it, but when it comes to the crunch, that's a different thing. So they're the most conservative political force imaginable. We call them pseudo left, not because the emphasis is not on left, the emphasis on pseudo. They're not really left wing at all. They're very much integrated into the bureaucracies, for example. So many of their top people have leading positions within every trade union. And, depending on the country, in Britain, they might be on 100,000 or 80,000 pounds, which is about 90,000 euros. If you're a trade union bureaucrat in America, you can stick some notes on. They get really good pay. So they operate within as a sort of special anti-socialist detachment, left-talking anti-socialist detachment of the labour and trade union bureaucracy.
That's what we would call controlled opposition, right? They're the controlled opposition.
Yeah, and they're
one aspect of the controlled opposition.
Well, they control opposition would be a better way of putting it. Because anybody who's moving to the left, there's so many people who they'll be on a college campus somewhere and they'll be moving to the left. They're attracted to socialist sentiment. And who do they meet? They meet a member of the ISO who comes to a meeting and says, yeah, your left-wing sentiment, yeah, we agree with all that. You know, it's very good. We're revolutionaries and we've got a big red fist on our badge, etc. But what we're going to suggest to you is you join the Democratic Socialists of America.
Yeah.
And go in there and fight to push it to the left. And now they've the ISO, which is interesting because they have liquidated completely now. They don't exist as an organization. They are fully paid up members of the DSA. It's not that they are, you know, supporting Sanders from the outside. They're supporting the DSA. They have no independent existence whatsoever. And that's generally the tendency. You know, the more the class struggle develops, the more the working class begins to break from the bureaucracies and to challenge capitalism, the closer these tendencies cleave to the bureaucracy. I mean, they know that Jeremy Corbyn, they would write in their newspapers, for example, that Jeremy Corbyn's not really that left wing. Yeah. You know, because they can compare him. He's not even a Tony Benn, for example, in the 1980s. And they'll say, oh, he's made all these terrible mistakes. And they'll list them all to their members and readers and say, oh, he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have allowed Ken Livingstone to be kicked out as a supposed anti-Semite. He shouldn't have allowed Mark Wadsworth to be kicked out as an anti-Semite, or Jackie Walker to be kicked out as an anti-Semite. He shouldn't have voted for Trident. He shouldn't have allowed a free vote on Syria. He shouldn't have done this. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have done the other. But then they'll say that, but he's the one the workers support. He's about as left-wing as you can get away with. So what we've got to do is critically support Jeremy. And throughout the entire course of that period, when Corbyn was trying to rescue the Labour Party and its reputation, instead of ruthlessly criticising that project, they went along with it. And the net impact of that is that now Boris Johnson is in government and Keir Starmer is the new leader of the Labour Party. So that massive possibility in which hundreds of thousands of workers and young people join the Labour Party has finished up with the most right-wing government Britain's ever seen.
Yeah.
And a political leader of the Labour Party who was the former director of public prosecutions. And he's a knight. He's Sir Keir Starmer. He's a millionaire.
And he is a Blairite. He is a Blairite, and he was involved in. I'm wearing a shirt in solidarity with Julian Assange. I'm with WikiLeaks. He was involved in making sure that he was involved in trying to extradite Julian Assange to Sweden and saying to the Swedes, "Don't get cold feet."
That was in the document that was issued by his department. The Swedes were considering dropping the extradition request because their case was so flimsy and concocted. And it was the DPP that intervened, the Director of Public Prosecutions, whether it's Starmer as an individual, but his department said, don't you dare get cold feet. You carry on this. This is important. Because they wanted a back channel to remain open as a possibility of getting Assange out of the country and into the United States via Sweden.
Yeah,
and
they wanted to inflict an even more painful, slow death that Julian Assange is already experiencing. But they'd rather he be humiliated in Sweden, and then of course Sweden extradites him to the U.S.
Well, I don't believe Sweden has ever opposed an extradition request from the United States.
Oh, really?
And there was no case against Assange in Sweden. No charges were ever brought. Ever. Because the case was flimsy. This was consensual sexual relations. Everybody knew it. They were with him. The two women were with him over several days. There was no charges. There was no evidence. There was no physical evidence. On its face, it was bogus. But that was never the issue. They wanted to get into Sweden to send him to the United States. And that is why Assange had no choice other than to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Because he knew that. He knew that's what they were planning.
Yeah.
And the reason why that lasted so long is because the Labour Party, the trade unions, and all of the pseudo-left groups in Britain, we've got the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party. The same tendencies will exist in Belgium, different names, but the same tendency. All went along with this frame-up. In 2012, they all said
they threw Julian Assange under the bus, it made my blood boil, and it's just Jeremy Corbyn. I always thought it was just very strange. How can this guy who was part of the Stop the War coalition not ever say a single word in defense of Julian Assange the entire time he was leader of the opposition? Well, until he's about to leave being leader of the opposition.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's Corbyn's, that's a measure of Jeremy Corbyn. As much as anything else he's ever done, that's the real measure of Jeremy Corbyn. But by that same criteria, the pseudo-left tendencies who said nothing after 2012, in which they said that Julian Assange should go to Sweden and face his accusers because no one should disbelieve women. This new principle, despite the fact it was clearly a state frame-up, and then even called for him to be no platformed on university campuses, for example, in Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party and tendencies like that, and have said next to nothing ever since. Nothing. Julian Assange is one of the most consequential journalists in world history. What he revealed of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan had a galvanizing impact on public consciousness of millions of workers and young people were shocked and animated by what he did. It's understood that WikiLeaks played a significant part, for example, in the events that led up to the Tahrir Square in Egypt.
Yeah,
he has revealed high crimes and misdemeanors. He's now being tortured in Belmarsh maximum security prison. His life is in danger. He's been subject to involuntary detention in totally appalling circumstances that have done terrible damage to his health, including his immune system. He's got a lung condition, and they will not release him. They're keeping him in a prison in which coronavirus, COVID-19, is rampant, both in the prison population and even amongst the guards. He can't see his lawyers. And these people, even under those circumstances, refuse to defend him. These tendencies, well, they're pro-imperialist tendencies. They're pro-imperialist tendencies. And if anything happens to Julian Assange, they will have blood on their hands.
Yeah, just
as surely as Boris Johnson, just as surely as Donald Trump, and no one should forgive them for it.
I certainly won't, and I hope that their members and their donations have dropped because of that. Because a lot of people, the reason why Julian Assange is not getting the kind of mass solidarity he deserves is because so much of the left-leaning media and those institutions that you mentioned threw him under the bus. And they threw him under the bus because of the history that you've just explained to me, and because many of them, I'm sure, are influenced by by insincere NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and because of the Trump victory, everyone is they're all suffering from Trump derangement / Putin Russia derangement syndrome. And instead of they've all thrown him under the bus. And have you noticed that the best truth tellers and mythbusters when it comes to the Julian Assange case, like John Pilger, are not on the Democracy Nows of the world anymore? They're not on any of these popular left-leaning outlets to set the record straight about Julian Assange.
Sorry, my cat just jumped up.
No problem.
Sorry about that, Youri.
It's okay.
There are some hazards in political life. No. Look, the first thing is that we should be clear on is there is no doubt, for example, that the embrace of identity politics by the pseudo-left tendencies played a part in their rejection of Julian Assange. They have in their membership, they had a sort of hysterical right-wing campaign that justified everything by asserting that you must believe women. Now, when has that been a legal principle?
It should be innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly. There are basic fundamentals here. And secondly, however, is really anyone that looked at this, how could you possibly believe that there was a coincidence to these allegations being made against someone who was enemy number one of US imperialism? Sorry about this.
That's okay. It's okay. Continue.
You don't get that with Jeremy Corbyn, do you? Look, but more fundamental, you see, is that WikiLeaks was actually opposing wars that they supported. They supported Syria. They supported the claim that this opposition, they described the Syrian opposition as a sort of semi-Bolshevik insurrection. They were writing idiotic statements about the creation of Soviets in Syria. They were populated,
or they would talk about how the Kurdish separatist movement was this sort of anarcho syndicalism movement, and I think unfortunately many of them also got influenced by Al Jazeera's shameful weapons of mass deception on both Libya and Syria when they depicted all of these rebels as left-leaning secular fighters, when really they were not even wolves in sheep's clothing. They were just wolves.
Well, yes, but I mean, bear in mind that leading members of the AFL-CIO have their connections with the ISO, and these bureaucracies were entertaining all sorts of opposition movements. They were in Libya, etc., etc. They knew a lot of what they were saying was lies. I mean, these were Soviets.
You mean without having to look at Qatari-funded media like Al Jazeera, Middle East Monitor, or read all of the the junk findings of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch?
Look, the point about it is that all the evidence was there. I mean, these were tendencies that were funded by the CIA. The CIA's connections with Islamic fundamentalist tendencies, for example, stretching back to the Afghan wars were all well known. They knew all of this. They chose to stress what they chose to stress for political reasons. It's not because they're confused. Their wrong positions are not the source of political confusion. Their wrong positions are the product of a political orientation. You know, they use Marxist phrases, but they use Marxist phrases to deceive. It's quite conscious. Quite conscious.
Yeah.
Some of their leading personnel, such as if you look at someone like Christine Buchholz in Germany, she's sitting down with leading Defense Department, German defense officials, discussing imperialist military strategy, even as she's probably got a bust of Lenin on her desk. It's just a fraud. I'm not talking about everybody in these tendencies, but they are led by political scoundrels.
Unbelievable. Before we get, and let's put a pause on that. Before we get more into that, and by the way, I completely agree with everything you said. Spot on. This is why people should read you at the World Socialist website and get into the World Socialist website. But alrighty, we got to talk about it, even though it depresses me reliving this. But okay. Election autopsy. Let's talk about the election autopsy. In your opinion, why do you think the Corbyn project suffered such a shocking massacre at the last UK general election?
Well, the common explanation of the left is that Jeremy was defeated by the divisions over Brexit.
You don't believe that?
Well, it played its part.
Yeah.
But Corbyn is, even on that question, he's the author of his own downfall. Because Corbyn never put an independent position for the working class on the Brexit question. He first of all, he abandoned his old sort of semi-Stalinist opposition to the European Union, which he had when he was a follower of Tony Benn and the alternative economic strategy, and became and acted as the loyal leader of the Labour Party in championing EU membership. When the election was lost, he was blamed for not being enthusiastic enough.
Yeah.
In his championing of the EU, and that
although giving the EU a 7 out of 10, I think is a pretty generous position.
Well,
I may agree with that position.
I will come to that, but he was, the payback was that the Blairites moved against him in this major leadership challenge. You know, and they used the issue of the EU to mount that leadership challenge, and it was unsuccessful. He actually got a bigger support than the first when he won. So even at that point, whatever the confusion exists on Brexit in the working class, there was still at that point support for Corbyn. Now, so why did after that, by the general election, why was Corbyn so deeply damaged by Brexit? It's because he allowed over the entire course of that period a faction fight between two right-wing pro-capitalist tendencies to go unchallenged by a socialist alternative. I mean, first of all, Brexit, we are absolutely opposed to the European Union. It's a capitalist club. It's a mechanism through which the imperialist states of Europe collaborate together within defined limits against their rivals in the United States, in Japan and China, etc., but also against the working class throughout the continent. But Brexit was a very right-wing alternative. This was not some pathway to a social democratic Britain. This was a perspective led by the far right wing of the Conservative Party, by Nigel Farage, backed by the most deeply reactionary forces, the hedge fund managers, of which Farage used to be, who were completely their perspective, as they said it, was to complete the Thatcher Revolution. Now, we in the Socialist Equality Party said you could not support a Remain position in the EU because that would involve too many concessions. It would be involving. Can I just sort this thing out?
Sure, no problem.
Do you want to pause? We'll come back.
No, it's okay. I just want to.
Okay, so it's laid down. We could not support the EU and a Remain position. The EU was the instrument through which they'd imposed savage austerity on Greece, on Portugal, on Spain, and workers throughout the continent. It was implementing the Fortress Europe policy of brutal attacks on migrants. So we were in principle opposed to the European Union as a capitalist club, but we were absolutely hostile to the perspective of Brexit, whose agenda was to complete the Thatcher Revolution, to liberate Britain from any remaining social constraints, step up exploitation, and forge a closer alliance with the United States in a developing trade war. That's what it was.
Do you think, before we talk more on the election autopsy of why Corbyn lost, so very quickly, so do you think Brexit in general and the endless Brexit soap opera was a cynical distraction from the real problems that face the working class in Britain?
Sorry, this is getting ridiculous. It wasn't a distraction. There were fundamental issues at stake for the British ruling class. What they were fighting is that, given the fact that the world was developing towards a trade war, who were they going to side with? And there was an argument about whether Britain was best positioned within the European trade bloc, or whether it was better to break free, play the field with China, India, etc., and be closer to America. Not everybody who was pro-American was pro-Brexit, because America, certainly under Obama, wanted Britain to be part of Europe to counteract Germany and France. But Donald Trump was the first, and this is what it was no accident that Donald Trump came to play such an important part in the calculations of the Brexiteers. He was the first US president who said, I actually want to see the breakup of the European Union, because it's not an ally, it's a competitor. And these people, Germany and France, need taking down a peg or two. And so he supported Brexit as a way of weakening the European imperialists in their competition for markets and resources. So any siding with any faction in that fight was to make the working class into cannon fodder, to decide which of two right-wing capitalist factions they would ally themselves with as a betrayal of the working class. The only way Corbyn could have combated that, and he would never do it because he's a capitalist politician, was to say neither the European Union nor Brexit, but the United Socialist States of Europe. Not an alliance with any faction of the British capitalist class or America or Berlin or Paris, but an alliance of the European working class against their common exploiters. So we called for a boycott in the referendum, and we were proved to be correct because everything that followed was deeply right-wing and reactionary. So that certainly played a part in what happened with Corbyn. But it was only one of many betrayals, because also factored in was the fact that many workers looked to Corbyn and believed him when he said he was going to change the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to fight the warmongers. He was going to restore a socialist perspective. But they just saw again and again this coward back down, retreat, betray, apologise, concede. I mean, the Blairites won without ever really doing anything. They won before they even started. Because, and the working class got the measure of Corbyn. They didn't know what to do. It wasn't like everybody was wise about it. But the one thing that nobody believed anymore by the general election is that Jeremy Corbyn represented an actual alternative. And interestingly enough, most of the when he lost, they say that he lost in the Red Wall, by the collapse of the Red Wall, the northern cities, over Brexit.
Yeah, because it was for anyone who wants to know about the Brexit referendum and the general election. I mean, I was of the opinion that it was electoral suicide for the Labour Party to support a second referendum, because that was going to because the people they needed to win in any general election in a post-Brexit society was the North, the Midlands, and Wales, which were the places that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. And then I guess you can say some bought into the right-wing nationalist arguments of leaving. Others bought into the left exit argument. And it was just electoral suicide to go into a second, to go into a general election back in the second referendum, when those were the people, those were the so-called traditional Labour voters that they needed to win over.
Well, the fact of the matter is that the Brexit was less regional and more demographic. Most young people were for Remain, and the older end of workers were for Brexit. And very few of them were Lexiteers. The Lexit campaign never really went beyond the pseudo-left tendencies. There was a hostility to the European Union. Of course, there was some anti-immigrant sentiment. There was all sorts of confused protest, etc. But the fact of the matter is that Labour lost votes across the board, north and south. And what was most striking is that the younger generation, the loss of the youth vote was as big, if not bigger, than the loss in the north. And it was not; these were not people that were pro-Brexit; they were pro-Remain. But the issue
but wasn't that because they thought that Corbyn wasn't too Remainian enough, so they engaged in this ridiculous tactical voting of, we're going to vote for an EU left reformist Corbyn person there, we're going to vote for this liberal Democrat Remain here, Green's not going to contest any of of the two over here?
Well, the vote went all over the place, Labour's vote. It went to the Conservatives, although a lot of the biggest thing was that Labour voters stayed at home. There was a collapse in the number of people who voted for Labour, and they didn't either go to the Conservatives or the Greens or the Liberal Democrats. They just didn't vote for anybody. And of course, some people voted for the Conservatives, although a lot of people that voted for the Conservatives never voted for anybody in the previous general election. They were the sort of pensioners who were angry and pro-Brexit, and it wasn't all a healthy thing, and it wasn't all an unhealthy thing. And it's the same with young people. Some voted for the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Some didn't vote at all. There was a decline in the youth vote. But when you strip away all of the various manifestations, what happened? Corbyn had betrayed on a more fundamental level. He betrayed the socialist aspirations of those who put him in power and those who voted in substantial numbers, almost to the point where he won in 2017.
Betrayed them because of betrayed them how?
He betrayed them on Brexit, and he betrayed Remainers and Brexiteers because he allowed the working class to be so deeply divided on such a reactionary basis instead of advancing an independent perspective. He betrayed them on their desire to kick the Blairites out of the Labour Party. He kept them in. He insisted on party unity. He betrayed them on Trident. He betrayed them on NATO membership. He betrayed them by instructing Labour councils to implement Tory cuts. He betrayed them all along the line.
So you think, and do you think that led to a to just Corbynistas being demoralized?
I think it led to some being a lot being demoralized. I think it led to some being angry. I think it led to a differentiation within Corbyn's support base. What I think in the short to not even the medium term, but the short term, what it's going to lead to is a realignment of sections of who had illusions in Corbyn towards a genuine left-wing alternative. Certainly, our experience as a party, the Socialist Equality Party, is that we would, even up to that general election, we would speak to people like young people or workers, and they would say, "I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
I actually agree with what you're saying." But still, the only way of stopping Boris Johnson
is by supporting Jeremy Corbyn.
Others said, "I'm not voting for anybody," all sorts of positions. But if anything has suffered a shipwreck, it's a notion that you can get hold of the Labour Party and turn it into a left-wing party.
I always thought that that was going to be a doomed project. Because the Labour Party, people have to understand, even when the Labour Party had Clause 4, which said that it was a democratic socialist party, even when the Labour Party had that. They always were for imperialism abroad and propping up the British Empire. So even when they were a bit of a socialist reformist party at home, and they were never that much of a flaming left-wing party to begin with, even when, you only have to look at Harold Wilson when he was leader, the Labour Party was always, at best, it was a controlled opposition party and the rival oligarch party. Never a serious socialist party at home, and certainly was never an anti-imperialist party abroad. Well, I always thought Jeremy Corbyn, even if he did have a democratic mandate, even if he did have huge popular support amongst people of different colors and the trade unions and so forth, it's like what Dr. Jill Stein said about the Democrats. You cannot have revolution in a counter-revolutionary party, and that's how I feel about the Labour Party in Britain, the Labour Party in New Zealand, the Labour Party in Australia, and
Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said. I mean, Jill Stein's about as far removed from revolution as Jeremy Corbyn is, but the point here is that what happened over the last decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 20 years, is that you had this collapse in the political authority of the old social democratic parties. Historic reversals. I mean, before Corbyn took power, people spoke about Pasocification, by which they referred to the collapse of the Social Democrats in Greece. and the emergence of Syriza. All throughout Europe, there were the formation of what were called, variously defined as broad left parties, whether it was Die Linke in Germany, the Left Bloc in Portugal, Syriza, Podemos
in Spain.
Podemos in Spain. And the only thing that was unique about Corbyn or different was that it developed within the Labour Party as opposed to outside of it. But the perspective was that it was possible to build some new instrument that could still connect with the trade unions and would still implement a left reformist program by getting together a loose amalgamation of social forces, not really just the work, not really, or primarily the working class, but environmentalists, Greens, feminists, people of colour, this horrible phrase, all this, and all get it together. And these many identities and many oppressed identities would then come together and create some sort of left-wing vehicle as an alternative to the old discredited parties and towards the perspective of building a genuinely socialist party. And this last period has seen the shipwreck of every single one of them. It's not just Corbyn. Before Corbyn, it was Syriza in Greece that were elected on a mandate to oppose austerity, and then ended up implementing austerity worse than the New Democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And Podemos is now in government in Spain, propping up the PSOE and supporting its repression of the Catalans and every other imaginable crime. The same with Die Linke. It's not really an opposition party anymore at all. It supports wars. It supports the military. It takes office in various states in Germany and implements austerity. You know, it's a huge experience with the fraud of an alternative to the building of a genuine socialist party. And now, last year, if you recall, before the coronavirus pandemic, the year before, there was a huge uptick in the class struggle. Millions of people took to the streets all over the world.
Yeah.
And what was striking about these movements, which were all animated by the struggle for democratic rights and against social inequality, is they kept speaking of, everybody was remarking that there was no parties involved. Trade unions were absent. And they spoke about they were speaking about leaderless revolutions. Well, there is no such thing as a leaderless revolution, but a rejection of the old leaderships was taking place.
Yeah.
The issue now is, where is the leadership going to come from? Because to make a revolution, you need a party. You need an instrument that you can unite the working class, not just in one country, all the different social strata that make up the working class. This very, when you speak about the working class, it's very heterogeneous. You know, there's skilled workers, there's impoverished workers, there's all sorts of differences within the working class, but they share a common interest, but that has to be fought for. And then you have to unite workers in Britain with workers in Belgium and America, because the capitalist class operates internationally, and you can't defeat it unless you too operate internationally. And so the perspective that was fought for by Trotsky of world socialist revolution is now the most practical, significant issue that the working class has got to address. On whatever the social problem that they confront, whether it's the environment, mass impoverishment, job losses, the threat of war, the coronavirus pandemic, the only way that we can defeat this is by unifying workers across all national barriers and distinctions in a common struggle for socialism. And that's what the International Committee of the Fourth International represents. That's what my party, as a section of the ICFI in Britain, the SEP, represents. And that's what is contained, the perspective underlying everything that's published on the World Socialist website.
Why do you think? I wanted to talk to you about blue labor, but before I get into that, why do you think Jeremy Corbyn, who he said his mentor was Tony Benn, who many people say was the best labor leader that Labor never had and the best prime minister Britain never had, and he was a Lexiteer. He was opposed to Britain getting into the European Union, viewing it as a as a neoliberal institution. Why do you so now Jeremy adopted the kind of Yanis Varoufakis position of being what I call an EU left reformist. Why in the wake of Brexit couldn't he have just articulated that, hey, it's not all doom and gloom leaving the European Union, because look at the kind of policies we can do, which all of you, whether you're for the European Union or for leaving, can agree on. And he also failed to even push back against a lot of the propaganda, whether it was what was happening, whether it was the Western-backed right-wing oligarch in Venezuela, and other foreign policy topics, which I was very disturbed. His foreign secretary Emily Thornberry twice denigrated the democratically elected government of Maduro. She equated Maduro with Duterte's Philippines and Saudi Arabia. Going back to what we were talking about, Julian Assange. When I asked her, will a Corbyn government free Julian Assange, she said that Julian Assange needs to be sent to Sweden to face his rape allegations. And there was all sorts of disturbing things like that, and of course the fake anti-Semitism crisis. I mean, why couldn't Jeremy Corbyn have just called BS to this smear campaign, and he could have easily said, hey, people like Glenn Secure, people like Jackie Walker, Tony Greenstein, Moshe Machover, and others. These are Jewish people. How dare you slander them as anti-Semites? They're just legitimately criticizing the state of Israel. Why couldn't Jeremy Corbyn or any of his supporters that you see on the BBC, like Faiza Shaheen or Navarra Media, make that case? The Lexit case or the anti-imperial case, when Jeremy Corbyn has spent his entire life fighting, against the European Union for its neoliberalism and against British imperialism.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn hasn't spent his entire life fighting against anything. Jeremy Corbyn is a dyed-in-the-wool Labour politician. He's not an anti-imperialist. He has selective and conditional criticisms of elements of imperialist foreign policy, but he's not an anti-imperialist politician. He's not a socialist. He believes, as an advocate for years, that you can reform your way to a socialist nirvana in Britain. His internationalism is, to platonically support various regimes around the world on a selective basis. But it's a form of politics that it doesn't constitute an anti-imperialist policy. If you're anti-imperialist, you have to have it's not imperialism as a policy, it's imperialism as a world system. Unless you advocate a change in the world, i.e. ending capitalism and replacing it with world socialism, then you're not consistently anti-imperialist. Corbyn is he spoke about a new type of politics. It's an old type of politics. he represents. Everybody knows it. We've had an experience with it. Left-talking Social Democrats, and Corbyn's not even that left-talking compared with some in the past. I mean, one of the problems we had with speaking to young people is they'd seen such vile creatures like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that, that someone like Jeremy Corbyn seemed like a breath of fresh air, but the air was pretty stale for anyone with some knowledge of the past. He's been around a long time. He sat on the front bench, on the back benches for 3 decades, voting against this, voting against that, and collecting his pay packet at the end of the week. And he's a very comfortable man. He's had a very cozy life, and he was thrust into a leadership position, and he made the biggest hash of it the world's ever seen. But he couldn't oppose the anti-Semitism without saying this is a destabilization campaign waged by the Blairite wing of the party. They're out to cut the throat of the party membership. They should be kicked out. You couldn't just call BS, as you say. You would have to mobilize the membership against the enemy. But Corbyn was dedicated to preserving the integrity and authority of the Labour Party. That's why he couldn't defend even his own supporters. It's true what you say. Jews who have been accused of being anti-Semite, but even the non-Jews, for the most part, were not anti-Semitic.
Exactly.
There is no doubt that there is a small fraction of those people that came into the Labour Party whose anti-Zionism is mixed with a liberal dose of anti-Semitism. We all know this. There are those within the left whose, the purveyors of the theories of the Rothschilds ruling the world and Bilderberg and all the rest, whose support for the Palestinians shouldn't conceal the fact that they're rotten right-wing individuals. But they're a minority tendency, an excrescence.
Yeah.
And the left would be able to deal with them without anybody, trying to blanket describe anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. They could be dealt with in no time flat. Tiny group of interlopers in the workers' movement that should be summarily expelled. Fine. That wasn't the problem. The problem is that this was used as a stick to beat the Labour movement into submission, into supporting the crimes of the State of Israel against the Palestinians. And that's why Jewish socialists opposed it. But Corbyn couldn't do it. Not because he didn't know that was what was happening, but to fight it, you would have had to wage war on the Blairites. And that would have unleashed a social movement that he didn't want unleashing. He wanted the Labour Party to be intact at the end of it. If he'd have pursued this, the Labour Party would have split.
Do you think that explains why John McDonnell can make a speech at the Labour Party at any Labour Party conference, and he can attack the Tories and he can attack the Tories for privatization, this destruction of workers' rights, that, but John McDonnell talks about PFI. That was not a Tory policy. That was a new Labour policy. And he says in the same speech, Gordon Brown, I may have disagreed with him on the Iraq War, but the way he lifted millions of children out of poverty. And I thought to myself, excuse me, the banking crisis, the deregulation of the banks and all those dodgy white-collar criminals, that was under New Labour's watch, which led to the rise of, David Cameron and the Tories having a comeback.
Well, he's not just apologising for the crimes of the New Labour Blairites. He's actually committing a few of his own. I mean, first of all, while he's, making all his, faintly left talk, he was on a tea and biscuits charm offensive in the city of London. And he was basically saying, look, what we need to do is recalibrate austerity. You know, you're sitting on a social time bomb. And what Labour's going to do is going to provide certain investment funds for small businesses, and we might slightly increase the top rate of income tax, not too much. Certainly, and corporation tax, not too much. Certainly not as high as it was under Gordon Brown.
Come on, Chris. Don't you want to be part of the boards? Didn't he say that he would like workers to be part of like the boards of?
Yeah, what a wonderful perspective! It's something that we all aspire to. But so it was a calculated campaign of politically disarming the working class. It's not. I'm not making this up. How else do you explain it? It's not just hypocrisy. It's a perspective. You know, John McDonnell started off in the militant tendency in the 70s, I believe. Mm-hmm. He's been around as long as Jeremy Corbyn. They've been through it all. They've been doing this for years. They'll get on their platforms and they'll shoot their mouths off, and then they'll go and sit down with the people that they've been criticising and work out what to do next.
With friends like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, it's that, you know, Trotsky's ultimate statement, coming back to Leon Trotsky, at the beginning, in the run-up to the Second World War, he was developing a program for the Fourth International. It was eventually published as the Transitional Program, and he called it the death agony of capitalism and the task of the Fourth International. I mean, this is on the eve of one of the most bloody periods in world history. The Holocaust, 60 million dead. You know, ended up with atom bombs being dropped and everything else. And he said, all talk to the effect that the situation not ripe for socialism is deception. Yeah. It's not only ripe, it's rotten ripe. He says, but the central problem is that the working class doesn't have the necessary political consciousness, program, and leadership. He says, so the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. The basic issue confronting the working class is for it to build the type of leadership is required for the era which the working class is now living in. Now, in the post-war period, when there was all these minimal reforms and welfare states, etc., this appeared, and we were told that it was all being refuted. Well, now, certainly over the last 20, 30 years, and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're beginning to see capitalism stripped bare in all its naked glory. You know, wars, attacks on democratic rights, imprisonment of political prisoners in London. We've got a political prisoner in London being tortured. We've got mass unemployment. We've got environmental degradation. We've got criminal policies being pursued that are leading to thousands and thousands of deaths worldwide due to this coronavirus pandemic because they've destroyed the health services in country after country. So we're getting a big lesson now. We're moving into a different type of period in which the class struggle is going to become very real. The brutality of capitalism is going to be exposed to millions, not just in the oppressed countries, but in the advanced countries, in Belgium, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in America, in Canada, in Australia. Social relations are undergoing a fundamental transformation, and politics is going to have to be fundamentally transformed in the same way. You need a new axis of struggle, a revolutionary socialist axis of struggle, and you need a party that's capable of fighting for that. So that's why we're talking.
Yeah. And I think
we're bringing this to some sort of conclusion, so I'm trying to give you one.
The SEP will fill that void. But going back to Brexit and Lexit, do you? I mean, obviously, I underestimated the power of propaganda. I really, really underestimated the power of propaganda, and I really thought that that Jeremy Corbyn was. I mean, I knew there was probably a big chance he was going to lose because of the ongoing anti-Semitism smears and him not calling BS to that and defending his comrades, his supporters broadly, and of course the never-ending soap opera, which was Brexit. So I underestimated the power of propaganda because I thought that Corbyn was going to. I thought there was a little bit of a chance he would have come out full swinging again. But do you think the fact that so many working class voters who not only voted for the Tories but voted for the Brexit Party, in the tactical voting, the fact that they vote against Lexit MPs like Dennis Skinner, Chris Williamson, who had to run as an independent because he was wrongly booted out of the Labour Party on the fake anti-Semitism stuff, and then even people like Laura Pidcock, who were EU left reformers. Do you think the fact that they were rejected and the elect and people voted for the Tories over them means that that in some ways the working class have kind of lost their innocence? And you've talked to me about this part of the Labour Party called Blue Labour.
I'm not quite clear the question you're asking, so I'll try and.
Okay. I'll rephrase. I'll rephrase the question. The fact that many working class voters, who I understand if some of them supported Brexit for whatever reason, left-wing reasons or right-wing reasons. So I understand if many of them were angry with Corbyn's position on second referendum. But the fact that Dennis Skinner, who was a Lexiteer, an MP from Bolsover, was booted out, and Chris Williamson, who had to run as an independent, and he was actually saying that we need to start, embracing Lexit and making the left case to leave the European Union. The fact that all of them were booted out and voted against, giving the Tories a bigger majority, has the working class voters in Britain kind of lost their innocence then?
I don't know what a loss of innocence means. Did the working class lose its innocence? It's not a blushing bride. The working class is a class of which is exploited and oppressed, but has the potential to be the most powerful revolutionary force on the planet if it's provided with a leadership. It wasn't provided with a leadership. It was provided with a misleadership.
Misleadership on Corbyn's parts?
Misleadership on Corbyn's part. Misleadership on the part of every one of those individuals that you referenced, including Chris Williamson. I mean, Chris Williamson is no anti-Semite, and his driving out of the Labour Party was a witch hunt, and he was slandered. But Chris Williamson also is the author of his own destiny. He was actually thrown under the bus by the leader that he told people to support, Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't the Blairites that got rid of Chris Williamson. It was Jeremy Corbyn. He refused to defend him, like he refused to defend everybody else. Whether it's the Lexit thing. You use this term, and I don't accept it. It's a sort of bogus definition. Look, the Brexit campaign was right wing. Just because a few pseudo-left tendencies organised the occasional public meeting and said we're for a left exit, wasn't the narrative. That played very little role in why people supported Brexit or opposed it. The Brexit campaign was led by Boris Johnson. It was led by Michael Gove. It was led by Nigel Farage. And the lefts who supported it, including the Socialist Party, Socialist Workers' Party, and Mr. George Galloway, left, right, forward march, like Churchill and Stalin, we fight, me and Nigel Farage are on the same team, betrayed the working class. They lent a false left coloration to a right-wing project, and they helped discredit socialism just as surely as the Remainer Blairites.
Okay.
With respect, I mean, Laura Pidcock, I don't think most people know Laura Pidcock from a hole in the ground. They didn't vote against Laura Pidcock. Labour voters abstained on voting the Labour Party. And I don't think they all transferred to the Tories. Some of them will have. But I think the Tories mobilised their constituency and Labour demobilised its constituency. So in the main, I think Labour lost votes. They lost all over the place. Their vote crumbled. They lost to the Liberal Democrats. They lost to the Greens. They lost to the Tories. They lost some to the Brexit. The Brexit Party did terribly. The Brexit Party had no purpose anymore. The Conservative Party became the Brexit Party. That was the end of Nigel Farage's career as a significant political figure.
Well, that's because the Remain fundamentalists, they did their tactical voting, and the Brexit fundamentalists did their tactical voting.
Well, I don't think it was tactical voting either. Because that implies some sort of conscious strategy. Why would you vote for Nigel Farage, which is a small party, the Brexit Party, when you could vote for the Tories, a much bigger party that was pro-Brexit, and had a leader that's saying they were going to get Brexit done? They weren't tactically voting for Boris Johnson. They supported Boris Johnson. But they didn't support Jeremy Corbyn. And the reason why they didn't support Corbyn is what I've said to you before, not because of his twists and turns on Brexit. That was a contributory factor. The reason why they stopped supporting Jeremy Corbyn is he promised them change and failed to deliver. And Labour's crisis in the North didn't start with Jeremy Corbyn. It started in the 1980s when they allowed the destruction of the pits and the closure of the steel mills and turned these places into industrial wastelands. So everybody was a bit, you pay a price for this. And if young people don't go out to vote, and that's where you find your audience for socialism, then there'll be a shift to the right. Because the tired generations set the agenda. It'd be like having a discussion with you, and putting my dad on the other side of it. You'd find there was a huge gulf of opinion. It's not that these were everybody in the older generation is betrayed socialists. Not true. They're generally more conservative. Not always. But the older you are, usually, not as a golden rule, but they're more conservative. And if the younger generation don't take the lead, then reaction will triumph. So there's a particular appeal that has to be made to the younger generation. They're the ones that are going to make a socialist revolution. If you don't have the younger generation, you have nothing. And actually, all the Brexit parties have got the pensioners.
Yeah.
They've got the pensioners, and that's not the future. The younger generation was generally pro-Remain because they don't like nationalism, they don't like xenophobia, they're not racist. They have to go abroad to work, they have to go abroad to study. There was also, they were critical of the European Union, but embraced the idea of a sort of an identity bigger than the nation.
Yeah.
So there was a progressive element within it that could be appealed to and provided with a socialist perspective. And what we'll say to those workers in Britain now, or even in the continent, that we are absolutely hostile to the Brexiteers. Anything that waves a Union Jack is not good. It's not progressive. We're now told that you should be proud of your country. Yeah, really? What we're proud of is the collective struggling humanity. Whether a worker in France, a worker in Belgium, a worker in Italy, a worker in Germany, they're our allies. They're our allies in struggle.
Yeah.
And not anything to do with the Union Jack. Nothing to do with the butcher's apron.
Actually, which leads to my next question. But that's very interesting that you said butcher's apron, because I have a friend of mine, Robert Eggington. He's this brilliant Aboriginal, Indigenous Australian historian. He has this cultural museum and healing center and history museum called the Dumbarton Kayana Gallery, and he once said about the Australian flag, "I do not recognize the Australian flag. It's a butcher's apron." But you were talking about nationalism, and did a lot of the people who voted for Brexit and those who claim to be on the left, as you would call them, the pseudo left, did blue Labour have an effect on what took place in the last general election?
Blue Labour is a right-wing tendency. It was set up by someone called Maurice Glassman, and its basic appeal was that you had to be socially conservative and rally round the flag, hence Blue Labour, and its slogan was "Flag, Faith and Family." Now they've abandoned the faith thing because that's problematic, but they were saying that there is such a thing as progressive patriotism, and the traditions of community and all the rest, and keep the home fires burning, nostalgia, but it's very reactionary, it's very right wing, and once you go on that route, you're heading towards Oswald Mosley, Benito Mussolini territory.
Were they?
So did they have any influence?
Were they just nationalists? Like not even left nationalists? They were just nationalists.
I don't really know what left nationalism means. I mean,
like a left nationalist. Like a left nationalist is somebody fighting for the so say any country like Haiti or Jamaica. So if you're a left nationalist, you will team up with sometimes the elites the elites of your country to kick out French colonialism or British colonialism. And
you just answered your own question, Youri. I mean, Britain is not an oppressed nation; it's an imperialist nation. How can you be a left nationalist in Britain? Britain's not an oppressed nation. Britain is an imperialist nation that oppresses others. So how do you arrive at the point where you're a left nationalist in the UK?
Because because the Paul Emberbys of the world, he's a guy part of the fire the firefighters union. He was part of some of those Lexit events, and you told me when you saw an article I had written where I talked with this with the head of the firefighters union, and I asked him, are you going to be able to win over people like one of your members, Paul Emberby, who wants out of the European Union because he says that that's a better way of achieving the socialism?
Well, again,
they think like the Paul Emberbys of the world, like they think that the European Union, which violates sovereignty and implements neoliberalism, is making. I assume they would think that Britain is sort of colonized by the by the European Union. There are some who even think that Britain is colonized by the United States, just like you have these, Canadian left nationalists who think that they're a colony of the U.S. when no, you're not. You're just an imperial partner in crime to the American empire.
Well, I think, again, you've answered your own question. Britain is an imperialist state. It's not colonized by the European Union. It's not the 51st state of the USA. It's British imperialism. It's one of the most dominant economies in the world today. It's got centuries of criminal activity under its belt. It's oppressed countries all over the world. It's soaked in the blood of colonial peoples, and there's no such thing as left nationalism in Britain. If you support the British state, it's a right-wing position. And if you try and dress that up in some sort of nostalgic version of old-style Labour and Clement Attlee and the war and Tony Benn and all the rest, so what? That's not what defines your politics. You've defined your politics by supporting British imperialism and by apologising for it, by making bogus claims that it's somehow oppressed by the EU. The EU was a boss's club which Britain was part of. It wasn't under the yoke of Brussels. It was in an alliance with German imperialism, French imperialism, Italian imperialism, in pursuing its imperialist interests.
And like you said, the reason why you would have wanted people to have completely abstained from the referendum was because it was basically a civil war between two rival oligarchs.
Two right-wing camps, not just individuals, but two right-wing bourgeois camps. And the Paul Emberys of this world adopt a pseudo left-wing language, basically, which is quite right-wing. I mean, they speak about the working class as some sort of cloth cap wearing, whippet owning caricature, and contrast them to the Labour Party, which is supposedly rooted in the metropolitan elites. Well, it's not actually true. The working class is a very disparate and heterogeneous force, and a perspective, Paul Embery's perspective, will never appeal to Caribbean Asian workers in London that have got nothing whatsoever to do with Brexit and are antagonistic towards it. But it's not about what people say about themselves. It's about what they represent objectively. And we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion, because I've got to bring it to a conclusion. But I just want to say one thing, perhaps, again, as a summation. Look, socialism, what was the phrase that Marx was associated with? The Communist Manifesto, the closing stanza of the Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win, right? Now, internationalism, there is no socialism without internationalism. You can't be a left nationalist, a socialist nationalist. And even if you're opposing imperialist domination of an oppressed country, that doesn't turn you into a nationalist. That's a consistently internationalist position. Internationalism is the taproot of socialism. It's the measure, but the only measure by which it can be judged. Unless you're an internationalist, you're not a socialist. On May the 2nd, for example, we are holding a May Day rally. We're having it on May the 2nd because it's got to be online, and Saturday, the 2nd is a Saturday, and you're going to get a better audience than you would on a Friday. But it's International Workers' Day, and we're celebrating it by bringing together as many people as we can online to discuss the coronavirus pandemic, the failure of socialism, and the failure of capitalism, and the necessity for a socialist alternative. Because capitalism really has been, the failure of capitalism is manifest in this coronavirus crisis, because it's millions of people's lives are being endangered by capitalism, and they're saying, so what? Get back to work. So we're going to hold that, and what we appeal to can always, the alpha and the omega of our appeal is to the international unity of the working class. We're building an international party. So when you consider tendencies like Blue Labour or any form of national organisation, they're condemned to be reactionary by the actual conditions of the world today, because we live in a world economy in which peoples are united in common production processes, in which borders are increasingly artificial, and in which conflicts between the assertion of nationalism is bound up with trade and military war, no matter what dressing is placed on the dish. That's what nationalism is. Nationalism is a route to trade and military war. It's the breeding ground for right-wing reaction. It's what is tapped into by Vlaams Belang. I think that's what it's now called in Belgium, or the AFD in Germany, or the former National Front in France, National Rally. It's what Bolsonaro represents. It's what Modi represents. It's what Trump represents. It's what Boris Johnson represents. You can't oppose any of these tendencies unless you're a consistent international socialist. And that's where we're at. And the big issue now is for the working class to become conscious about where it is in the unfolding crisis of capitalism, and to adopt the program and leadership required for a successful struggle against capitalism.
On that fine note, on that wonderful fine note, and dare I say very optimistic note, actually.
Yeah.
Dare I say optimistic note.
I'm a political optimist. You can't be a socialist and not be optimistic.
Well, on that final note, because I know you mentioned that you had to go, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined on 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting, by Chris Marsden, who is a member of the SCP. And Chris, what's your position in the SCP? Are you head of the SCP, or?
I'm the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party.
All righty. Socialist Equality Party. And folks, if you were demoralized and depressed because of the Corbyn Project being eviscerated, it's not all doom and gloom. Join the SCP.
Thank you very much.
And read the World Socialist website. I really highly recommend people subscribe to them. I'm going to link them on our YouTube and SoundCloud, and I will link where you can read Chris's many wonderful pieces on the World Socialist website. Chris, thank you for joining us on this third episode, and this is definitely going to be the first of many conversations we're going to have, and thank you very much for your generous
You're too kind, Youri. Bye-bye, and thank you very much for having me.
All right. Ciao, ciao, my friends.
Okay. See you, Youri.